Mara stepped inside with rain sliding down her coat, laughing in a way that felt wrong the moment it filled the doorway. The sound echoed too sharply, too quickly, as if she were trying to drown out the storm outside. Or the fear in her eyes when she finally noticed what I was holding. The broken bracelet dangled from my hand, cold and wet, its snapped thread trembling with every shaky breath I took. She stopped laughing immediately, the air tightening between us like a pulled wire. I tried to ask again where she'd been, but the question caught in my throat, smothered by the look she gave me. Wide, startled, almost pleading. The scent of rain mixed with dust, and somewhere in the building a pipe groaned as if listening. Mara whispered my name, barely audible, as though speaking louder might shatter something neither of us was ready to face. Would you forgive someone if the truth was worse than the lie? Lightning flashed, revealing the mud lodged in the bracelet's links. For the first time tonight, I wondered if she was afraid of me, or of what I'd discovered. What if betrayal was the only way to survive? Daniel stepped back without meaning to, letting the silence spread until it pressed against the walls. Mara shut the door gently, the soft click echoing loud enough to rival the wind outside. She kept her gaze low, following the trail of wet footprints she'd made from the hall to the living room. He wanted answers, sharp ones, clear ones, but the defeated curve of her shoulders made him hesitate. The bracelet felt heavier in his hand, its edges scraping his skin each time he shifted his grip. Mara said she could explain, but the way her voice wavered made him wonder if the truth might break them more cleanly than the bracelet had. The storm thrashed outside, and somehow it felt quieter than the space between them. Daniel wasn't sure he wanted to hear what she was finally ready to say. Mara finally lifted her gaze, eyes shining with something heavier than the rain dripping from her hair. She said she hadn't meant for things to spiral like this, that she'd been trying to keep him safe. But from what she wouldn't say, Daniel felt the question strain inside him like a trapped breath. She stepped closer, slowly, as if afraid he might retreat. When she reached for the bracelet, he pulled back without thinking, and something inside her seemed to collapse for a moment. She murmured that the bracelet wasn't supposed to break, that someone had made her promise to keep it intact. That word, someone, sent a cold ripple down his spine. Wind rattled the windows, but Daniel barely heard it over the pounding in his ears. Thunder cracked so loudly the window shuddered, and Mara flinched before whispering that she hadn't been alone tonight. Daniel felt the floor tilt beneath him, his breath stalling mid-chest. She insisted it wasn't what he thought, but her refusal to say more made his stomach twist. Every late night, every strange call, every unexplained bruise flickered through his mind like scenes from a film he didn't remember agreeing to watch. She wrapped her arms around herself, trembling, eyes pleading with him not to assume the worst. But the fear in her voice made him wonder if the worst hadn't already arrived. Mara backed toward the window, breath fast and uneven, her voice wavering as she said there was something she needed to show him. Something that would make sense of the broken bracelet and the nights she vanished without explanation. Explanation. Daniel followed despite the dread coiling in his stomach. The storm outside roared like an animal, shaking the glass beneath her palm as she pressed her hand against the window pane. She whispered that everything started the night she found the bracelet buried behind the old train yard. Daniel froze. That place had been abandoned for years. No one went there anymore. Not unless they were looking for trouble. Daniel followed Mara through the dim apartment, each step echoing louder than the storm outside. She moved quickly, almost too quickly, like someone trying to outrun her own shadow. When she stopped near the kitchen table, she didn't turn around right away. Instead, she pressed her palms against the wood as if steadying herself. Daniel waited, pulse climbing, knowing whatever she was about to reveal would shatter the fragile silence between them. She told him she hadn't meant to find the bracelet, that it had been buried deep beneath gravel and rusted tracks like it had been hidden on purpose. She described the strange humming she heard before digging it up, a sound so faint she thought she imagined it. Daniel tried to interrupt, but she pushed on, saying that the bracelet felt warm when she first held it, like someone had just taken it off. A shiver crawled across his skin, and he wondered whether she regretted bringing it home that night, or if she regretted telling him the truth now. Mara finally turned to face him, her expression tight and exhausted, as if she had rehearsed this moment and still wasn't ready for it. She said the bracelet had been part of something larger, something she didn't fully understand yet. Daniel tried to ask what she meant, but she shook her head, saying there were things she hadn't told him because she didn't want him anywhere near the place she found it. She described the way the air felt wrong that night, too still for a stormy evening, and how she sensed she wasn't alone, even though the yard had been abandoned for years. Daniel tried to picture her standing alone in that forgotten place, digging through dirt and rust, and the image struck him harder than he expected. She whispered that she wasn't supposed to take the bracelet, that it belonged to someone. Daniel's stomach tightened at the way she said someone, like the word carried far too much weight. Daniel leaned against the counter, gripping its edge as Mara explained that she had been followed after taking the bracelet. She didn't know who it was, but she'd seen a figure near the yard, standing too still in the shadows, watching her without moving. Daniel felt a cold ache form in his chest, imagining her fear, imagining the quiet footsteps echoing behind her. Mara admitted she tried to pretend it was nothing, that she hadn't mentioned it earlier because she didn't want him to worry. But the broken bracelet in his hand made it impossible to ignore now. She said the man had appeared again 2 nights ago, outside the apartment, but vanished before she reached the door. Daniel's breath halted, and for a moment he thought the storm had gone silent. He struggled to understand how long she'd been carrying this secret alone. The storm outside roared again, as if echoing the rising panic in the room. Daniel stepped closer, trying to make sense of everything she was saying, attempting to ground himself in something solid. "Mara," said the figure, hadn't approached her, hadn't spoken, just existed at the edge of every place she went after that night. At the market, near the bus stop, twice outside the building. Daniel felt anger flare inside him. Anger that she hadn't told him sooner. Anger that someone had been stalking her. And anger at himself for not noticing. She insisted she wasn't trying to shut him out. She just didn't want him to get pulled into whatever she had uncovered. But it was too late now. Whatever danger she had feared had already stepped into their home the moment the bracelet broke. Mara drew a shaky breath and told Daniel there was more, something she hadn't said yet because she feared what it meant. She said the bracelet didn't just break, it reacted. When it snapped, she swore she felt the air shift, like something exhaled nearby. Daniel remembered the faint metallic scent he smelled earlier, but had ignored. Mara stepped back from him, opening a small drawer beneath the counter, pulling out a folded piece of paper. She said she found it inside the bracelet's latch, too tightly wedged to remove until after the break. Daniel hesitated before reaching for it, the weight of the moment hanging between them. She told him the note wasn't written in a language she recognized, and worse, she didn't think it was meant for her. As he unfolded the paper, the storm slammed against the window, as if warning him not to read what waited inside. Daniel unfolded the paper slowly, expecting a simple message, maybe a warning, maybe proof that Mara's fear had grown out of stress rather than danger. But the moment the symbols came into view, written in looping strokes that seemed to pulse against the page, the air in the room tightened. The markings didn't look like any alphabet he knew. They twisted in shapes that almost formed words, yet shifted the longer he stared at them. Mara hovered close, her breath shaky, watching his reaction with dread. She didn't bother hiding. She said the symbols matched ones she'd seen scratched into the concrete near the train yard, half buried beneath years of rust and dirt. He asked why she hadn't mentioned that sooner, but she just looked at the floor, whispering that she didn't want to believe what she'd seen. Daniel felt the silence press harder, thick as smoke, as if the paper itself didn't want to be read. In the storm's dim glow, the ink almost shimmered, and he had the unsettling sense that the note was waiting for something. Maybe for him. Daniel tried to focus on the symbols, but every time he blinked, they seemed to shift, curling subtly into new shapes. He told himself it was a trick of the light, the storm, his exhausted mind, but the unease crawling through his body didn't care about logic. Mara stepped closer, reminding him of the humming she'd heard when she first touched the bracelet. He felt a chill at the thought of it, imagining her alone in that forgotten yard with something humming beneath the earth. She said the sound had returned tonight, faint but real, just before the bracelet snapped. Daniel's fingers tightened around the edges of the note, and he asked whether she thought the figure who followed her was connected. Her silence answered more clearly than her words ever could. The storm outside rattled the window frame, and he wondered if they were already too deep into something neither of them could escape. Mara moved toward the window, staring into the storm-darkened street, as if expecting to see the silent figure standing there again. Daniel followed, the paper still clutched in his hand, and asked her what she thought the symbols meant. She said she didn't know, but she felt sure the person who had been following her wanted the bracelet back, and now the note too. The way she said it made Daniel's skin prickle, as though they were being watched even now. He asked if she'd told anyone else about the bracelet or the figure, but she shook her head slowly, saying she didn't trust anyone else to believe her. The street lamps flickered outside, bending their light through the rain. And for a moment, Daniel thought he saw a shape leaning against the far fence. When he blinked, it was gone. The question hanging between them pressed harder. If someone wanted the bracelet returned, what were they waiting for? The lights flickered again, longer this time, and the apartment dimmed to shadows before stabilizing. Mara stepped back from the window as if the darkness itself pushed her away. She told Daniel that she had gone back to the train yard once after finding the bracelet, hoping to convince herself it meant nothing. She had seen more symbols there, scratched into metal beams, etched into wood, burned into stone as if carved by heat instead of tools. Daniel felt his pulse skip as she said the air near those marks felt charged, like standing near a live wire. He asked why she hadn't told him, and she said she didn't want to drag him into something she didn't understand. The storm boomed again, shaking the floorboards, and Daniel realized this wasn't something they could avoid anymore. Whatever those symbols meant, whatever the bracelet had belonged to, it wasn't finished with them. Daniel laid the note flat on the table, running his fingertips along its edges, feeling the strange texture of the paper. Thicker than normal, almost waxy. Mara hovered beside him, arms wrapped tightly around herself as if bracing for impact. She asked him to look at the symbols again, saying she noticed something earlier, but hadn't been sure. When Daniel leaned closer, he saw faint grooves beneath the ink, like the marks had been carved into the paper rather than written. A shiver scraped down his spine. She whispered that the grooves didn't match the surface. They were deeper, as if pressed from the other side. Daniel lifted the note toward the light, and the shadows trapped in the grooves shifted into new shapes. Something inside him tightened with the sense that whatever message this was, it hadn't been meant for human eyes, and now that they'd seen it, something might already be coming. The room felt heavier as the storm deepened, each rumble shaking loose something inside Daniel he didn't want to name. Mara stood beside him, her hands trembling slightly as if the air itself unsettled her. She said there was one more thing she hadn't told him, something she'd been trying to forget. The night she returned to the train yard, she felt watched again, but this time, the figure didn't hide in the shadows. She saw him standing near the rusted tracks, face obscured by the dark posture, too still, too deliberate. Daniel tried to stay calm as she described the way the man seemed to tilt his head toward her, almost curious, before simply disappearing. Not walking away, not running, just gone. Daniel felt his chest tighten as she admitted she didn't think he was human. She hadn't said it aloud until now, but the way she stared at the floor made it clear she'd believed it from the start. Daniel swallowed hard, the dread finally settling into something undeniable. Daniel pressed his palms against the table, trying to piece together everything she'd told him, but the story kept twisting into something stranger. Mara said she'd tried to convince herself the disappearance was just her panic playing tricks on her. But when she looked down, she found fresh dirt on her shoes. Dark, wet earth she hadn't stepped in. That detail pulled at Daniel's thoughts like a hook. He asked if she thought the man had approached her without her realizing, but she shook her head sharply. She said it felt more like she had moved instead, like her memory had skipped. Daniel felt a cold sweat rise at the idea, and the symbols on the note flickered at the corner of his vision as though they were listening. He didn't know whether to tell her what he suspected, that the bracelet wasn't just an object she'd found, but something that had found her. Mara walked toward the window again, as if pulled by something outside. Daniel followed, unwilling to let her drift out of reach. She whispered that she had seen the symbols before, not just at the yard, but days earlier, scratched faintly into the sidewalk near their building. Daniel felt a sting of disbelief, then fear, as he pictured the markings slowly surrounding their lives, without either of them noticing. Mara said she hadn't connected the patterns until tonight, but once she did, everything felt wrong. Like each symbol was a piece of something much larger closing in around them. Daniel asked whether she thought the man had left them there. She didn't answer. Instead, she pressed her forehead against the cold glass and whispered that she sometimes felt watched even in daylight. The storm cracked loudly, drowning out her breath, and Daniel felt the walls closing in too. Daniel pulled her back gently, guiding her away from the window as the wind howled against the glass. She apologized in a whisper, saying she didn't mean to hide things from him. It just never felt real until now. Daniel told her they needed to face this together, but even as he said the words, he felt a tremor of uncertainty. The note still lay on the table behind them, symbols twisting subtly in the dim light, as though responding to their voices. Mara confessed she had felt a pressure on her chest earlier tonight, right when the bracelet snapped, like something had been released. Daniel felt the hair on his arms lift as she said it. The storm outside surged, thunder rattling the apartment. And for a moment, Daniel imagined the darkness pressing against the walls, waiting. Daniel turned back to the table, staring again at the note, feeling the symbols hum against the silence. Mara moved beside him, clutching her hands together as if trying to hold herself still. She said she remembered something else. When the man appeared near the tracks, she felt the ground vibrate, not from trains but from something beneath the earth. Daniel lifted the note toward the light, and once again the grooves inside seemed to shift, forming patterns that made no sense and yet felt intentional. Mara asked whether he felt it too, that something was moving closer. Daniel didn't answer right away. He just watched the ink shimmer, uneasy and alive. The storm slammed against the building, lights flickering violently, and in that brief darkness he felt it, something watching from the edge of the room. Daniel stood frozen, listening to the faint hum rising from the note, as if something inside it had begun to wake. Mara clutched the counter for balance, her breath short, eyes fixed on the tiny grooves that carved shifting shadows across the paper. She said the humming matched the sound she'd heard in the train yard, the one she had pretended wasn't real. Daniel felt the air tighten again, as though the storm itself leaned closer to hear them. He asked whether she thought the note was some kind of message, but she shook her head, saying it felt more like a signal, something that called out rather than spoke. The idea chilled him deeper than he expected. A low vibration moved through the floorboards, subtle but unmistakable, and both of them stared at the table as the note quivered slightly. Daniel stepped back, pulse racing, unsure if he had imagined it. Mara whispered that whatever had followed her might not be outside anymore. It might already be here. Daniel reached for the note, but before he touched it, the humming stopped abruptly, leaving the room wrapped in suffocating silence. Mara stepped closer to him, whispering that she didn't think they should touch it again. Daniel hesitated, torn between fear and the need to understand. The quiet felt wrong, like sound itself had been pulled from the air. He asked Mara whether the humming in the yard had stopped the same way, and she nodded slowly, her face pale. She said that, right after the humming ended, the figure had appeared, almost materializing from the shadows. Daniel's heartbeat quickened at the thought. The light flickered across the ceiling, and the sinking feeling inside him deepened as he wondered if someone, was waiting for the silence to fall again. Mara stepped closer, her voice barely audible as she said she didn't feel alone in the room anymore. The apartment seemed to narrow around them as Daniel picked up the bracelet fragments from the table, feeling their cold weight settle into his palm. Mara flinched at the sight of them, saying she'd never felt anything so strange as when it snapped. She said it wasn't the sound of metal breaking she remembered most, but the feeling that something had been released. Daniel turned the fragments slowly, noticing that the thread inside the metal casing was darker than he remembered, almost scorched. He asked her whether she had ever seen the figure touch the bracelet or come near it, and she shook her head. She said she always felt him before she saw him, like an invisible shift in the air. Daniel felt a similar sensation now, an almost imperceptible pressure pushing inward from the corners of the room. The storm pounded the windows as if trying to warn them, but the dread settling in Daniel's chest told him the warning had come too late. Mara took a step back, pressing her hand against her mouth as she admitted something she had kept hidden since the first night. She said the figure hadn't just watched her, he had spoken. Not in words, but in something she felt more than heard. A rush of sensations that left her dizzy and terrified. Daniel stared at her, trying to understand, trying to imagine what kind of presence could communicate without sound. She said the message had felt like a question, one she couldn't fully translate but understood anyway. Where is it? The memory brought tears to her eyes, and Daniel felt a chill crawl through him. If the figure had been searching for the bracelet, then the broken fragments and the shifting message inside the note meant something far worse. Daniel reached for her hand, telling her they would figure it out, but the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. Mara looked up, trembling, and said she feared the figure was coming back, and this time, not alone. The lights flickered again, longer than before, plunging the apartment into momentary darkness that felt thick and heavy. When they brightened, Daniel and Mara both turned toward the hallway, where a faint sound echoed, soft, rhythmic, distant. It reminded Daniel of footsteps on gravel. Mara whispered that she heard the same sound the night she found the bracelet. Daniel moved closer to the hallway, trying to see through the shadows, but the noise stopped the instant he stepped forward. He felt something cold brush the edge of his awareness, like eyes settling on him from far too close. Mara grabbed his arm, begging him not to go further, saying she could feel the same pressure she felt in the yard right before the figure appeared. Daniel swallowed hard, the air thick with anticipation. Whatever had been searching for the bracelet had finally found its way to them, and the silence that followed felt like the moment before something stepped into the light. The hallway stayed unnervingly quiet, but Daniel felt something shift in the air, a subtle tightening like the world was holding its breath. Mara clung to his arm, whispering that the pressure was getting stronger, the same suffocating weight she felt when the figure first appeared near the yard. Daniel forced himself to step back from the shadows, sensing that whatever lingered there wasn't waiting for him. It was studying them. The storm outside cracked again, and for a split second, the flash of lightning illuminated the hallway, revealing nothing but warped wallpaper and darkness. Still, the dread wouldn't leave his bones. Mara said she could feel something moving closer, like a thread pulling tight around her ribs. Daniel told her they needed to leave, but even as he said it, He knew the apartment wasn't the thing keeping them trapped. The silence grew sharper, stretching thinner, and his breath hitched as he realized the humming had returned. So faint, he barely registered it, yet undeniable. Something was coming, and it wasn't trying to hide anymore. Daniel guided Mara back toward the living room, the humming growing steadier with every step, as though sensed with their movement. She trembled, insisting that the sound wasn't coming from the note anymore, but from somewhere deeper, almost beneath the floor. Daniel felt it too, a pulse under the wood, faint but rhythmic, like something large shifting far below. He asked if she thought the figure was beneath the building, but she shook her head with a terrified certainty. She said it didn't feel like one presence. It felt like more than one, maybe several, gathering or waiting. The lights dimmed again, but this time they didn't flicker. They dulled as though drained by something unseen. The air warmed unnaturally, thickening until every breath felt like inhaling steam. Daniel reached for her hand, grounding himself in the one thing that still felt real. Mara whispered that they might not have found the bracelet by accident. Daniel squeezed her hand tighter, unable to argue. The humming sharpened suddenly, vibrating through Daniel's chest like a withheld scream. Mara staggered back, gripping her temples, saying the sound was inside her head, now, louder than the storm. Daniel dropped to his knees beside her, trying to calm her as her breaths turned short and frantic. She cried out that the symbols were moving, not on the note but behind her closed eyes, twisting into patterns she didn't recognize, forming shapes she couldn't translate. Daniel begged her to look at him, to stay with him, but she shook her head violently, saying the shapes were pulling her somewhere else, somewhere dark and impossible. He grabbed her shoulders, grounding her with his voice as the lights dimmed to near black. The storm rattled the windows so fiercely that the glass trembled. Daniel realized this wasn't just fear. Something was reaching for her, something that knew her, and the humming wasn't calling anymore. It was summoning. Mara gasped as the humming stopped abruptly, replaced by a suffocating silence that made Daniel's ears ring. She opened her eyes slowly, tears streaking down her face, and whispered that she saw something. A place, not a person. She described a cavernous space beneath the earth, lined with symbols glowing faintly, like embers. Daniel held her trembling hand as she said the figure was there too, waiting in the center of the chamber, surrounded by others shaped like shadows. She said they were searching for something missing, something stolen. Daniel's pulse hammered as he asked whether they wanted the bracelet or the note. Mara shook her head with a rising panic. They weren't searching for an object. They were searching for a person. For her. Daniel felt the room tilt, dread spilling through him like ice. Whatever had marked her with that bracelet had chosen her long before she understood the danger. Daniel helped Mara stand, her legs unsteady as though she'd been pulled through a nightmare and left half awake. She whispered that the hum wasn't gone. It was only distant now, like footsteps echoing down a long tunnel. Daniel led her toward the center of the room, away from the walls that seemed to breathe with the storm. He told her they needed to leave the apartment before whatever was coming reached the surface. Mara nodded weakly, but her gaze drifted toward the hallway again, as if something tugged her attention back into the darkness. Daniel stepped in front of her, blocking the view, insisting she stay with him. She apologized for everything, for not telling him sooner, for dragging him into something she didn't understand. Daniel said none of it mattered. What mattered was getting out. But before they could move, a soft sound echoed from the hallway. A single tap, deliberate and close. Mara's breath stilled. Daniel's heart dropped. The tap came again, louder this time. Something was no longer waiting. It had arrived. The tap echoed again, sharp enough to cut straight through the storm outside. Daniel felt Mara press against his back, her breath trembling as the air in the hallway thickened into something almost solid. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed, as if something just beyond sight waited for them to acknowledge it. Daniel forced himself to step forward. Only an inch, but enough to feel the cold gust sliding from the darkness. Mara whispered that the hum was close again, so close she could feel it vibrate behind her ribs. Daniel reached back, taking her hand and anchoring both of them to the last scrap of steady ground they had left. He said they needed to move now, but his voice wavered as another sound rose, a slow scraping, like fingers dragging across the wall. Mara squeezed his hand, choking back a cry, insisting that the figure wasn't alone anymore. Daniel swallowed, realizing that whatever had been searching for her had finally crossed the threshold. Daniel pulled Mara toward the kitchen, hoping the wider space would give them a chance to escape. But the humming followed, growing, tightening, filling the apartment like pressure before an explosion. Mara stumbled, gripping the counter as if the floor tilted beneath her. She said the humming wasn't just sound anymore. It felt like a call, pulling at her thoughts, urging her towards something she didn't want to understand. Daniel blocked the doorway, refusing to let her move closer to the hall. He told her to focus on his voice, to stay grounded, but she shook her head, whispering that the figures she'd seen in her vision were rising. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into rhythmic darkness, each pulse revealing a deeper wrongness settling over the apartment. Daniel felt the dread coil around him like a rope. Something was coming through, and not from outside. The humming surged all at once, swallowing every other sound, filling Daniel's skull with vibrating heat. Mara dropped to her knees, clutching her chest as if something inside her was thrashing to get out. Daniel knelt beside her, desperately trying to steady her breathing, begging her to look at him. She gasped that the symbols were back, thousands of them, spinning in circles around her mind like a storm of fire-lit markings. Daniel held her face between his hands, trying to pull her back to the present, but she winced, saying the shadows were speaking again. Not in words, but in those same crushing sensations she couldn't describe. He tried to lift her, but the room pulsed, the walls seeming to bend inward like soft clay. A deep, almost seismic thud echoed beneath the floor, and Mara's eyes widened in terror. She whispered that they were coming up. The thud sounded again, closer, clearer, as if something below the building pushed against the foundation. Daniel pulled Mara to her feet, urging her toward the front door. She stumbled but followed, her breathing uneven, her eyes fixed on some distant point only she could see. He reached for the doorknob, but before he touched it, the floor shook violently, sending a tremor through the entire apartment. Mara cried out, gripping his arm as the humming exploded into a low, resonant roar that made the lights burst with a sharp pop. Darkness washed over them, broken only by the flashing storm light from the window. Mara whispered that the figure wasn't trying to enter through the hallway or the walls. Daniel turned to her, heart hammering. Afraid to ask, she looked up at him, voice trembling, and said it was coming through her. The roar dissolved into a piercing stillness, and for a moment, Daniel thought the world had stopped breathing. Mara's hand slipped from his, and when he turned, she stood motionless in the center of the room, eyes unfocused, head tilted slightly, as if listening to a voice just beyond human hearing. Daniel called her name, stepping toward her carefully, afraid to startle whatever force held her in place. Her lips parted, but the voice that emerged wasn't hers. It was deeper, layered, vibrating with the same impossible hum that had been haunting them. Daniel froze as the voice asked the same question Mara had felt in the yard. "Where is it?" He backed away, realizing the presence wasn't speaking to him. It was addressing her directly, using her breath, her body. Mara blinked slowly, tears sliding down her unmoving face. Daniel whispered that she didn't have to answer, but her gaze drifted toward the note on the table. The hum thickened, the shadows trembled, and the voice spoke again, stronger this time. Daniel reached for her, desperate, just as the lights flickered back on to reveal the truth he feared the most. Someone, or something, was standing behind her.